Let's take you live to Kananaskis for a family photograph of the G7 Outreach Summit.
Leaders of some of the world's most powerful economies are meeting at the G7 summit near Calgary, Canada.
And I expect to, and I think our primary focus will be trade and trade with Canada.
Shock gripped the G7 summit in Canones, Alberta, as President Donald Trump abruptly left citing Middle East violence just hours before crucial talks on Ukraine, and Iran's sudden exit announced via spokespersons exposed with no press conference left allies stunned in a new U.S.-Gay trade deal overshadowing the summit's unity, as Trump's tariffs cost Canada billions and strained global ties, Prime Minister Mark Carney's. Canada is turning to Europe for new partnerships. This dramatic walkout deepens America's isolation, threatening the G7 strength behind closed doors. A seismic shift in Western alliances may be unfolding. President Donald Trump stunned global leaders by abruptly leaving the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, on Monday evening, just hours before critical security discussions began. His spokesperson Caroline Leavitt announced the departure through a brief post on X, stating that escalating violence in the Middle East demanded Trump's immediate return to Washington. This sudden exit, bypassing a formal press conference, disrupted the summit's agenda and sparked questions about America's commitment to its allies as tensions rise from Ukraine to Iran. Trump's decision to walk away has deepened doubts about U.S. leadership on the world stage. The announcement came late Monday, catching other G7 leaders off guard. According to CBS News, Trump boarded Air Force One shortly after a leader dinner and landed in Washington by early Tuesday to oversee developments in the Middle East, where Israeli air strikes targeted Iranian military sites. The conflict, now in its fifth day, has raised fears of a wider regional war, yet Trump's choice to leave without addressing the summit directly left allies scrambling. He led key meetings with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to discuss North American trade disputes, further straining ties already frayed by U.S. policies. Trump's reliance on social media posts to communicate his exit marked a sharp departure from diplomatic norms. The Post, which offered no details beyond citing the Middle East crisis, fueled speculation about his motives. A prominent analyst on X argued that Trump's departure was less about urgency and more about avoiding tough conversations at the summit. The G7 had been grappling with pressing issues, including coordinating aid for Ukraine and addressing civilian casualties in Gaza. Trump's absence from these talks signaled a reluctance to engage in alliance building, leaving leaders like Germany's Friedrich Merz and France's Emmanuel Macron to fill the void. This move exposed cracks in America's global standing by skipping the summit's final day. Trump missed briefings on critical security threats, including Iran's growing influence in Syria and Russia's continued aggression in Ukraine. A European diplomat quoted by Reuters called the exit a blow to unity, noting that the G7 relies on U.S. participation to project strength against authoritarian regimes without America at the table. Discussions on imposing sanctions on Iranian oil exports stalled, weakening the group's ability to respond decisively. Instead, the summit, meant to forge a collective strategy, highlighted Washington's growing isolation. Trump's departure also underscored the instability of U.S. foreign policy. His administration claimed he could manage global crisis remotely, but allies questioned why he left a forum designed for coordinated action. The timing was particularly striking as the Middle East conflict demanded unified leadership. According to a BBC report, Iranian drones struck civilian targets in Israel over the weekend, prompting calls for de-escalation. Yet Trump's exit suggested he prioritized domestic optics over international cooperation. A Canadian journalist on X described the move as a slap in the face to allies, reflecting growing frustration with America's unpredictability. The economic backdrop added another layer of tension. Trump's tariffs, which have hit Canadian industries like steel and dairy hard, were a sore point at the summit. Data from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce shows these tariffs have cost exporters over $2 billion annually, fueling resentment in Ottawa. Leaders had hoped to address trade disputes, but Trump's early departure shut down those talks. Combined with his exit, this economic friction painted a picture of a U.S. leader more focused on unilateral action than partnership, pushing allies to rethink their reliance on Washington. For Canada, the implications are clear. Prime Minister Mark Carney, hosting the summit, faced pressure to maintain stability despite Trump's absence. He rallied the remaining leaders to continue discussions, but the U.S. withdrawal weakened their momentum. Ottawa, long a steadfast U.S. partner, is now exploring stronger ties with the European Union. Recent talks between Carney and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, reported by Politico, signal Canada's intent to deepen trade and security cooperation with Europe. This shift reflects a broader trend. Allies prepare for a world Where U.S. leadership is no longer guaranteed, Trump's exit has sparked debate about America's role in global affairs. Supporters argue he showed decisiveness by focusing on the Middle East crisis, but critics see it as a reckless abandonment of duty. A U.S. senator speaking anonymously to the Washington Post warned that Trump's absence could embolden adversaries like Iran and Russia, who exploit divisions among Western nations. The G7, once a symbol of democratic unity, now faces an identity crisis as its most powerful member steps back. The summit's failure to issue a unified statement on the Middle East underscored this fracture, leaving allies to navigate rising threats without clear U.S. guidance. Looking ahead, Trump's actions may accelerate a realignment of global alliances. Canada and the EU, frustrated by U.S. tariffs and diplomatic missteps, are laying the groundwork for closer collaboration. A recent EU-Canada trade summit cited by the Globe and Mail discussed expanding tariff-free exports to offset U.S. restrictions. If America continues down this path, it risks alienating partners who once stood firmly by its side. The Middle East crisis, still unresolved, will test whether allies can act without U.S. leadership or if they will fracture under pressure. This dramatic walkout was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern. Trump's next move at the G7, signing a trade deal with the United Kingdom, would further expose his preference for bilateral gains over collective progress, setting the stage for deeper allied divisions. The G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, was poised to act as a critical war council tackling urgent crises in Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, Syria, and Russia. Leaders gathered to forge a unified response to these global threats, but President Donald Trump's sudden departure on Monday evening derailed those efforts. His absence from pivotal security discussions left allies struggling to maintain momentum as U.S. tariffs strained economic ties. The summit's failure to align on key issues underscored America's growing isolation, pushing Canada and Europe to seek new paths. The summit's ambitious agenda addressed interconnected conflicts that demand collective action. Ukraine faced ongoing Russian assaults, Gaza endured a worsening humanitarian crisis, and Iran's aggressive moves in Syria heightened regional tensions. According to Bloomberg, G7 leaders plan to strengthen sanctions on Russia and coordinate aid for Gaza's civilians. Yet Trump's exit before these talks began disrupted the group's decisiveness. His decision to leave, announced via a brief X post by spokesperson Caroline Leavitt, cited the Middle East crisis, but offered no plan for U.S. involvement, leaving allies in disarray. Trump's absence had immediate consequences. A key proposal to redirect frozen Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine, reported by PBS News, stalled without U.S. support. This initiative, which could have provided billions in aid, required American backing to gain traction. Instead, the summit lost its chance to send a strong message to Moscow. A Ukrainian diplomat quoted by The Guardian expressed dismay, noting that Trump's cancellation of a meeting with President Vladimir Zelensky weakened Kiev's position on X. A security analyst called this a missed opportunity to show unity, highlighting the summit's diminished impact. Economic tensions compounded the strategic fallout. U.S. tariffs, including a 20% levy on Canadian agricultural exports, have cost Canada's farmers over $1.5 billion annually per the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. These trade barriers, discussed heatedly at the summit, eroded the trust needed for security cooperation. Leaders like France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Friedrich Merz urged a united economic front to counter global instability, but Trump's policies deepened divisions. His exit signaled that America prioritized its interests over collective goals, leaving allies to question Washington's reliability. The summit's role as a war council demanded clear U.S. leadership, but Trump's departure created a void. Intelligence briefings on Iran's militia activities in Syria, shared by NATO officials, went unanswered by the U.S. delegation. Reuters reported that plans to secure Red Sea shipping routes disrupted by Iranian-backed attacks faltered without American input. This lack of coordination weakened the G7's ability to counter Throne's influence, a growing concern as Iran supplies drones to Russia, per a UN report. The summit was meant to project strength, but also exposed Western disunity. Canada, as host, faced the challenge of salvaging the talks. Prime Minister Mark Carney pressed forward with European leaders, but the US's absence slowed progress. According to Politico, Carney held side meetings with EU officials to discuss joint aid for Gaza, where over 1 million people face starvation per Oxfam. These efforts, while commendable, lacked the weight of U.S. involvement. A Canadian official on X lamented that the G7 feels incomplete without America, reflecting Ottawa's frustration as it navigates a strained partnership with its southern neighbor. Trump's exit highlighted a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy. His administration's focus on unilateral action, coupled with tariffs, has pushed allies to adapt. Once reliant on U.S. leadership, Canada is now strengthening ties with Europe. Recent talks between Carney and EU trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, reported by the Financial Times, explored expanding tariff-free trade to offset U.S. restrictions. This pivot signals Ottawa's intent to reduce dependence on Washington, a trend driven by economic pressures and strategic necessity. The strategic implications are stark. Without U.S. participation, the G7 struggled to address Russia's advances in Ukraine, where over 500,000 people have been displaced this year, per UNHCR discussions on containing Iran's nuclear ambitions. A priority for leaders like Japan's Fumio Kishida also lost momentum. A defense expert on X warned that America's absence empowers adversaries, noting that Russia and Iran exploit Western divisions. The summit's failure to deliver a cohesive strategy left allies vulnerable to these growing threats. Canada and Europe are already responding to this vacuum. NATO's European members, led by Germany and France, are boosting defense spending, with France committing euro 3 billion to Ukraine per lemon. Canada, meanwhile, is exploring joint military exercises with EU nations, as reported by CBC News. These moves reflect a determination to act independently if U.S. leadership falters. The tariffs, which have strained Canada's economy, have only accelerated this shift as Ottawa seeks partners who share its commitment to multilateralism. The G7's faltering war council marks a turning point. Trump's absence disrupted immediate plans, signaling a deeper retreat from America's traditional role. Allies, once united under U.S. guidance, are now charting their course. A European diplomat, cited by DW News, predicted that Canada and the EU will lead where America steps back. This realignment, driven by tariffs and diplomatic missteps, could reshape global security for years. If this trend continues, Canada and the EU may forge a new security framework, reducing reliance on the U.S. in conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza. The summit's failure to unite has left leaders like Carney with a clear message: they must act without waiting for Washington. Yet the shock of Trump's exit was only the beginning, as his confrontational stance toward allies soon deepened the G7's divisions. Canadian media buzzed with speculation that President Donald Trump's sudden departure from the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, stemmed from a heated clash with Prime Minister Mark Carney over U.S. military plans in Syria. Reports painted a picture of a tense meeting where Carney rejected Trump's call for immediate air strikes, advocating instead for coordinated diplomacy. This disagreement and ongoing trade disputes fueled theories that Trump left to dodge further confrontations with G7 leaders as U.S. tariffs strain alliances. The episode highlighted Canada's growing alignment with Europe, signaling a shift in global partnerships. The meeting between Trump and Carney on Monday afternoon quickly became the focus of Canadian news outlets. According to the National Observer, the discussion grew contentious when Trump pressed for swift U.S.-led strikes against Syrian targets linked to Iranian militias. Carney refused to back the plan, emphasizing the need for broader G7 consensus and UN involvement. The standoff marked a sharp contrast in leadership styles, with Trump favoring rapid action and Carney prioritizing collective strategy. By evening, Trump had left the summit, leaving journalists questioning whether the dispute prompted his exit. Speculation intensified as details emerged. The Globe and Mail reported that Trump can-led all remaining engagements, including a trade discussion with Japan's Fumio Kishida shortly after the Carney meeting. His spokesperson's X post citing Middle East unrest did little to quell doubts. A prominent Canadian broadcaster on X called the timing too convenient, suggesting Trump's departure was a tactical retreat to avoid public discord. According to BBC News, this narrative gained traction as the summit's agenda included sensitive topics like Gaza's humanitarian crisis, where U.S. policies face scrutiny. The clash revealed deep strategic divides. Trump's push for air strikes aligned with his administration's focus on projecting strength, as seen in recent U.S. naval deployments to the Persian Gulf. Reported by Al Jazeera, Carney's resistance, however, reflected Canada's commitment to multilateralism, a stance shared by European leaders like Germany's Friedrich Merz. This split was not new, but grew more pronounced at the summit. As tariffs have already strained ties, which have cost Canada's energy sector over $1 billion annually per natural resources. Canada, the Syria dispute added a military dimension to the rift, pushing Canada closer to Europe. Canadian media framed the incident as a turning point. National Post columnists argued that Trump's exit was less about Middle East urgency and more about sidestepping a summit where his unilateral approach faced resistance. The outlet noted that G7 leaders had planned to discuss coordinated sanctions on Iranian oil, a move Trump's team reportedly opposed. His absence allowed Carney to steer talks toward de-escalation, aligning with EU priorities on X. A Toronto-based analyst praised Carney's restraint, calling it a stand for diplomacy over Impulsiveness reflecting public support for Canada's position, economic tensions amplified the fallout as tariffs on Canadian goods, including a 15% levy on natural gas, have disrupted cross-border trade per the Canadian energy regulator. At the summit, Carney sought to address these barriers, but found Trump unwilling to negotiate the Syria dispute amid this economic friction underscored a broader disconnect. Canada, reliant on U.S. markets for 75% of its exports per Statistics Canada, faces mounting pressure to diversify. Recent trade talks with the EU, reported by Reuters, aim to boost Canadian exports by 20% by 2027, signaling Ottawa's pivot away from Washington. The episode also exposed Canada's evolving role on the global stage. Carney's refusal to endorse U.S. strikes position him as a mediator, a role praised by European media. Le Figaro highlighted Canada's efforts to bridge G7 divides, noting Carney's push for a Gaza aid plan despite the U.S. absence. This leadership contrasted with Trump's approach prioritizing domestic optics, as evidenced by his exposts touting U.S. military strength. Canada's alignment with Europe grew clearer, with plans for joint EU-Canada naval patrols in the Arctic per CBC News, reflecting a shift toward collective security. Public reaction in Canada added pressure. Polls on X showed that 62% of respondents viewed Trump's summit behavior as disrespectful, fueling calls for stronger European ties. As reported by CTV News, protests in Edmonton demanded clarity on U.S. Canada relations, with signs reading, "No more trade punishments." The tariff issue central to these grievances has galvanized support for Carney's EU outreach. Per Politico, a planned EU-Canada summit in Brussels will explore defense and trade pacts, reducing Canada's reliance on U.S. leadership. The Syria dispute's implications extend beyond the summit. Trump's push for strikes risked escalating tensions with Iran, which has intensified its support for Syrian proxies. Per and report. According to DW News, Carney's call for restraint aligned with EU efforts to revive nuclear talks with Iran. Canada strengthened its diplomatic clout by siding with Europe, but widened the gap with the U.S. This divide, exacerbated by tariffs, threatens long-term alliance cohesion. A security expert on X warned that Canada's pivot could reshape NATO's dynamics as Ottawa seeks partners who share its multilateral vision. Strategically, the clash highlighted America's isolation. According to Bloomberg, Trump's exit left the U.S. sidelined on key issues like Iran's regional influence, which affects global oil markets. Canada and the EU, meanwhile, advance plans for humanitarian aid in Syria, committing $500 million per Oxfam. This cooperation, driven by shared frustration with U.S. policies, signals a new alignment. According to the Financial Times, Canada's trade negotiations with Germany and France aim to secure alternative markets, further reducing U.S. leverage. Looking ahead, the Trump-Carney dispute may accelerate Canada's European tilt. According to Global News, Ottawa's recent pledge to increase NATO contributions by 10% aligns with EU defense goals. If U.S. tariffs persist, Canada may impose counter-tariffs, as Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland hinted. Per CP20, for this economic decoupling and diplomatic rifts could redefine North American relations. The G7's failure to bridge these divides suggests a future where Canada and Europe act independently, leaving the U.S. to navigate global crisis alone. This tense encounter was only one sign of mounting friction. Despite his legal issues, the public's outrage over Trump's entry into Canada would soon ignite a broader debate about Carney's leadership and Canada's alliance with the U.S. President Donald Trump's abrupt exit from the G7 summit in Canonies, Alberta, coupled with his aggressive tariff policies, has deepened America's isolation from its traditional allies. His departure sparked by a clash with Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney over Syrian air strikes disrupted critical talks on Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran, weakening the G7's unity. Tariffs costing Canada's economy billions further strain ties, pushing Ottawa towards stronger trade and security partnerships with the European Union. This realignment is pivotal as Canada and Europe seize leadership roles amid America's retreat. The summit exposed the fragility of Western alliances, with Trump's actions signaling a preference for unilateral moves over collective strength. If the U.S. continues its tariff wars and diplomatic withdrawals, Canada and the EU will likely forge a new alliance prioritizing trade pacts and joint defense initiatives through NATO. This shift could marginalize America's influence, reshaping the global balance of power. Without a policy change, the U.S. risks watching its allies build a resilient network without it leaving Washington to face rising threats alone in a world where cooperation is vital.